Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. This is Patti Seger from End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin.
And Pennie Meyers from Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault.
And we're here today for Grant Writing Essentials. Thanks so much for coming and participating in this. We had this general feeling that we needed to do some kind of a Grant Writing Essentials for folks with two new RFPs coming out for SAVES and the Violence Against Women Act through the STOP grant program administered with Wisconsin DOJ. But in general, it's just really a good idea for us to keep thinking about how we write the most effective grants ever. So we thought it would be a really good time to conduct this webinar, and I'm glad that so many of you chose to participate. Thank you so much for being here.
And we're also working with DOJ to try to eliminate barriers, and Patti and I, both are addressing this, is to getting people in that haven't applied for funding before or a cultural specific program, is to help them get into the funding stream. And so, we decided to do the Basic 101. And I know in writing my own grants that I like to keep up and just kind of refresh too. So that's kind of what this is. Peter Fiala is here for technical support if you need anything. And if you have questions as we go, please just go ahead and write them, and then Peter's going to let us know. I'd rather address them because other people probably have questions too. I'd rather know that people are asking questions or have additional things that they need to know.
So yeah, so please ask questions throughout. So first of all, we're just going to start out by talking about what a grant is. A grant is a conditional gift or a conveyance of funds, and it does have strings attached. The funding source, whether government or foundation, identifies the focus or the problem to be addressed, but not the outcomes. And the idea really originates from the grantee. One of the things I often hear folks talk about is talking about the restrictions of their grants. You have to remember that you are the author of your grant idea. So other than the particular conditions that are attached to the grant, you should be thinking broadly about your ideas and really conveying them in totality. You are the master of the fate of what your program looks like. So what you write into the grant is what you will have to do. It's not being required by the funder as much as it's being required by you with your ideas. So I really encourage folks to innovate, to put all of their ideas in, and if the funder doesn't like them, they will come back to you and ask you to modify something if they feel like something is very far out of the scope of what the grant problem is. They will certainly come back to you and negotiate with you, but really make sure that you understand that the idea generates from you, so be cautious about not imposing too many limits on yourself and making room for creativity in the grant process.
So grant writing overview. It is really, you need to read the grant in its entirety, and I start from the beginning. I look, you need to be strategic, gather your data ahead of time, you plan ahead, follow the instructions, and like Patti said, being creative, the funders set a framework, but you're the one who's telling that story within that framework. So I think it's very important to tell a story, to understand what that story is, but also to make it attainable, because sometimes it's like, oh, well, I got to put all this stuff, and that's not, you're not going to be able to do that, and the funders kind of know that too.
So we're going to go into a little bit about before you write, and sort of get into reading that grant announcement really deeply. what's really important is to figure out initially, is your organization a qualifying applicant? And I always read that right away. Sometimes an announcement comes out and it's so interesting to me, and then I read it and nonprofits can't apply, only state government or local government can apply. Now, if there is an announcement that has government as the lead applicant, it certainly doesn't prohibit you from reaching out to your local government and asking them if they want to partner with you on it. So always keep that in mind, that government does have the capacity to pass that through to you. So you should be thinking creatively that way too, if it's really something that you're interested in. Also ask yourself, does the focus align with your mission? A lot of times, a grant, we're seeking money, and we are in a little bit of a dog-eat-dog world in our nonprofit existence. We have a scarcity of resources generally, and so we often find ourselves looking at things, applications just to bring money in the door. But that application, that particular grant program really does need to align with your mission and make sense for you to apply for. Does the grant, the third question to ask yourself is, does the grant, if awarded, sufficiently cover overhead expenses associated with the work? Because if it doesn't, it's unlikely that you're going to find another funding source to cover those overhead expenses. And then you'll find yourself in a position of having to raise unrestricted funds to cover the overhead associated with that position. So it's really important, and I think funders are becoming more and more aware of the need to cover overhead expenses, as we saw in the last year, our first-time shift with VOCA funds finally covering overhead expenses for the first time. So we really know that funders have become really aware that they do need to cover overhead expenses. But don't shortchange yourself on overhead. Really make sure you're adding in sufficient overhead to cover the work that's associated with that grant.
And that includes supervision time too, because somebody, you may not be directly doing the work, but you are supervising, so that would be the administrative time. And make sure that that is written in too. I think we shortchange ourselves. A lot of programs do. It's like, oh, okay, well, where am I going to cover that because we didn't put it in the grant? So I think you need to be aware of that.
And then finally, I just think we really have to answer the question, does your organization have the capacity to manage this grant project, including the compliance? Now, the announcement that's here, the photo of the announcement that's here is a state grant that's federal pass-through dollars. And the state funder has to pass on all of the federal compliance requirements, just as if it is federal funds. It's coming through the state. But the state has to pass on all of those federal grant requirements. At our next slide, we have a photo of an OVW grant. I often don't even recommend that people apply for these just because the compliance associated with them is so rigorous. And it's so easy to find yourself in trouble really quickly. They do come out and do audits and site reviews with all of their grantees. And they do pretty robust examination of your records. And the federal government will make you repay funds if they feel like you haven't used them exactly as they've awarded them, and if you're out of compliance in any way. So those are tough grants. But the two coalitions are here to support you guys in terms of figuring out compliance. I don't want you to not apply for these funds, but I want you to be ready for what it really means. So in this slide, we talk about having a plan, really starting early. As soon as you see that announcement come out, if you think it's something that you want to apply for, start early planning. Identify what you need to fulfill those grant requirements, and identify collaborators. And in your identification of collaborators, plan that you're going to compensate those collaborators as well for their collaboration with you. Often people think, I will collaborate with this other nonprofit in town, and they'll just willfully give their time. But we should always be building in adequate compensation for a nonprofit collaborator, if that's the case. Often government partners waive any compensation for collaboration, which is really great. But if you're collaborating with another nonprofit, make sure you make sure that you're getting that in, that you're working with them often and talking with them about what financially they would need to collaborate with you.
And on the federal grants, the MOU has to be part of it, and they all have to have a piece. And so starting early is very important in having the conversations, and then creating a document, because it has to spell out what each partner is going to do if there's compensation, and everybody needs to sign it. And we don't want to get down to the last minute and trying to get signatures on there. So I think that's a really important key issue here. And if you're going to need letters of support, start early. And so you're not last minute. You know, a lot of people have asked me, well, Penny, can you write it for me and then send it to me? And then, so it's like, okay, so then they can take the main points. So you have to be prepared to do that too.
So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about collecting data and relevant research to support your grant application. We've included here a number of sites that have really good resources for you. We start with the census because the census is conducted on a 10-year, every 10-year basis. But what I can tell you is that every year each state updates its census to the degree that it can. So we are here in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin as a state, a Midwest state, definitely has a majority population of Caucasian folks. But please don't say in your grant application, our county is mostly white. Actually go to the census and research the actual demographics of your county and include that in your application, whatever that may be. When the funder is asking you to cite the demographics for your county, they want specifics and they want to know exactly who's living in your county. And I can tell you that information may even surprise you because there are Hispanics and African Americans and Asians in every single county in Wisconsin. Most counties have indigenous native populations. All counties have elders. All counties have people with disabilities. All counties have LGBTQ folks. And all counties have low-income folks. And much of that data is available to you in the census. And one of the other things to know about the census as well, it gives you a good baseline. I would say it's generally an undercount, particularly when we're talking about immigrant populations, LGBTQ folks. Those are folks, in the last 10-year census was the first time they started gathering data on LGBTQ families. So it's the first time we're actually seeing that, but you know, it requires somebody to self-identify, and in a rural community it may not be totally safe. But I really wanted to emphasize that you really should go and get the census data for your county. You can just, you don't even have to go through all the machinations of the census.gov website. You can just type into your Google or other search engine a question, census data for County X, and you will get all of the most relevant census data for that county. The Bureau of Justice Statistics also has a lot of relevant research on violence against women. They're collecting a lot of data on our crime areas. And so you can go there and access a lot of sort of national reports on our crime area. So that can really help you to contextualize what's happening locally. And if you don't have local data, you can make some inferences based on what's happening nationally. There's, you know, our counties are not so unique that we have less violence than any other place in the country. So we can make some inferences there.
One of the things, too, is I would contact local law enforcement and the ADA if you're working with them, if you're a program, and because I think that's very important to say, this is what we're seeing. This is specifically in my community. We've got, 42 rapes that happened that were reported to police, and they've prosecuted 2. But I think that's important for people to know that you're reaching out locally, too. They don't always give you the data, but I think it's worth a try to do that.
Right. This is also your opportunity to look for innovation. And there may be research out there illustrating its importance and necessity. We're seeing a lot more research, for example, on prevention.
Yep.
And that's sort of a trending area. There is some research coming out about different ways of looking at housing for victims of domestic and sexual violence. So you may look there. So this is an opportunity for you to look for innovations in the field. Make sure you're including those citations in footnotes or in parens immediately after you cite something, but use a consistent citation method throughout. So don't do parens in some situations and then a footnote in others.
Yeah.
Make sure if you're going to footnote, you footnote throughout. If you're going to do parentheses right after you cite something, do that throughout. But be consistent. And include your own data. Data that you submit to funders in your grant reports also helps you identify gaps and needs that you could wish to address in your application.
It helps you tell your own story, too, because law enforcement may have like 42 rapes that were reported. You may be seeing hundreds of victims or clients coming through your agency. And that tells a story, too, that all of everybody's not, working with law enforcement or the systems, which is fine. We got a question.
Okay, so we have a question. Somebody wanted to know about where we would find data on prevention. The best resource right now is going to be the CDC website, the Centers for Disease Control, and you can just do an easy Google search or search engine search, Centers CDC Violence Prevention, and you'll find both sexual assault and domestic violence prevention data. There they are a central repository, but also the Violence Against Women Network, VAWNet, also has a fair amount of prevention materials on it. So that's also another really good place to check. Also the two national organizations, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, which is the Coalition for Domestic Violence Coalitions, and the Resource Sharing Project.
Yes.
Will have relevant data on their sites.
And we have increased the amount of data that we have on prevention on our website and lots of links. We get the Rape Prevention Education Grant through the CDC. And so there's a lot of either pass-through or different information on our website, too. And I know Patti is taken, or End Abuse is has grants for prevention, and so there's other materials on their website too.
Right. So both coalitions are locating resources on their websites as well to connect you with that.
Okay. So in looking at grant, it's really important to collaborate with staff. I hear as I'm traveling a lot of advocates or people that are in the field that don't ever get to see the grant, that really don't understand fully, the story behind it or what's going on. And so I think it's really important to sit down with your staff to collaborate and the staff that are going to be carrying it out. Is it feasible? So I may have a picture in my mind. I know when I sit down to write grants with my staff here, it's like, is this feasible? Because I may have one picture in my mind, but can we really do that? Or because they're in the field, they may have some really innovative ideas that we as directors or whoever's writing this grant may not see or think about. And so I always involve my staff, and I think that's really important. And I think to give them a copy of the grant so that they understand, what is supposed to be done, the big picture. And when you look at the timelines, the more information they know, I think the better off it is. The more buy-in that people have and that they think they have a part of it, I think the better it is. Because then they own it, they feel like this is, part of me. And so, for each one of the sections, for goals and for the timelines, I really sat down with staff and say, do you think this is doable? What can we do? And I think when you're looking at innovative ideas and new programming, go to your staff. I mean, they probably have, when we do SAVUS, I just got back from SAVUS, and they were like, yeah, especially newbies, it's like, yeah, this or that, and it's like, I'm not sure if that's feasible, but maybe we could work it this way. And I think that's really good, is to sit down with people that are younger in the field or that are newbie or whatever, they're not as burnt out as we are, and see what they think is doable, and then, kind of work on it.
So we're going to start talking about some specifics related to writing the proposal. Again, we encourage you to ask questions throughout. That's great. All of the proposals generally start with you identifying a problem description or a needs statement. This is where I'm going to just really emphasize that you really have to follow the grant guidelines exactly, organize your answers exactly in the format that the funders, have put into that application. Answer the questions completely. I will say that it's rare for me to see a grant application that just has one question. It's almost always like 3 or 4 questions. And make sure that you're answering every single element of that question, because if one put your answer under that question. Generally, when I get a RFP, I take the questions from the grant and I copy them into a blank document and I follow their format exactly. And then I go back and I double check all of my answers to make sure that I answered the question in the question. I will say, the coalitions get tapped heavily for grant reviews, and I've seen many examples of people answering the questions, but answering a component of a question someplace else in the grant. Yes. And it's really hard when we're having to hunt and peck around for the answer to that question and finally find it someplace there. So make sure you're answering those questions completely in the section of the question that's there. Again, include compelling data and statistics to strengthen your response, but even beyond data and specifics, tell a compelling story. Use an example unidentifiable from your work, or like a mix of a couple of folks' stories in your response. And of course, you would want to cite that and say, this example is a mix of several victim stories or something like that, so that we know it's not actual. But it's really important. This is not a time to be humble. It's a time to sing your organization's praises. You almost have to look at it, think about yourself going to a personal job interview and how you have to kind of talk yourself up to a person who you're trying to get to hire you. It's sort of the same way with grant writing. You have to tell the story of why you're the best organization to do this to do these services, and that there's no one else who could do them as well as you. So you just have to assume that the reader, don't assume that the reader knows the subject matter. I will say generally for the state funders, they are seeking out experts to read those applications. But at other entities such as foundations or state or county government or city government, you may not be having experts reading your application. So you have to be very descriptive.
And be careful with jargon words, too, that we know in our field that other people may not know. So, you know, I always reread everything, too. Like Patti said, you put it down and then you reread and reread.
And have someone else then read it.
Yes, because you fill in your own words.
So we're going to start talking about goals and objectives. This can be one of the more difficult things for folks. All grants require goals, objectives, outcomes, or measures. So it's really important for us to know the difference between the two. Goals are very broad. Goals should be very specific to the proposal, but I also want to say I've read a number of proposals that have as a goal, we'd like to get funds to hire an advocate. And I will say that's probably not the appropriate goal. That's one of the outcomes that you want to have. You want to hire an advocate. So, so make sure the goal, we're going to give you some examples of goals coming up next, but just make sure that your goal is specific to the proposal, and hiring an advocate as your goal, which may be your personal goal, is not the goal that the funder needs to see. Objectives are very specific. They are the specific sort of broad bucket things that you're going to do. They don't include all the action steps, but they are the things that you're going to do to fulfill that goal. Goals are very difficult to measure. They're somewhat intangible. Objectives are very measurable and very tangible. And we always try to use the SMART rule when writing objectives, that they're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're relevant, and they're time-bound. So we'll give you some examples here. So here's a goal. With this application, we want to improve law enforcement response to victims of domestic violence. The objective, which is a broad bucket action, train law enforcement with the city on a policy. Let me see this. Change law enforcement with the City A Policy Department on lethality assessment protocol. So the city has a policy on lethality assessment protocol. This wasn't written well. Sorry about that. And then attend 4 quarterly community response team meetings with local law enforcement. So those are goals. Under the objectives, I'm just going to say, it's not in here, there may be action steps. Yes. So the actions required to organize a training with law enforcement on the lethality assessment project maybe are action steps. They're the specific actions you need to take to set that up. But this objective is the kind of large bucket action that you're going to take to implement that goal. Prevent domestic violence in our community is the second goal.
Again, broad.
Again, very broad. The objective, again, broad but specific. Train 100 educators on healthy relationships curriculum. And another objective is hire a marketing firm to produce a series of public awareness advertisements on social media about teen dating violence. Again, underneath those objectives, there may be, a number of funders ask you to give some action steps for implementation of that objective. So there may be action steps that you would have to include. Action steps for training 100 educators would be contact the school districts in my county and arrange a training, arrange buy-in or whatever. So, you'll have your own action steps.
So project design, keep it clear and concise. Use your goals to introduce each paragraph, so bold your goals so that they are standing out right there, and follow the instructions. Part of the when you have goals and objectives, and then you're also going to have timelines too. So keep that in mind on grants. So staff volunteer recruitment and retention is a requirement for the grants. How are you going to do that? And you should actually have a plan in place for your agency. So be specific. How are you going to recruit? You know, and include them in there. You don't currently have a plan, use this as an opportunity to create one. So, you know, we will do a survey. My board does a survey of the staff if there are other things that we can do to, you know, entice them or support them and encourage them in their positions. Include details on how you recruit staff for vacant positions included in the budget. So you can put, you know, to be hired if it's a newly created thing. How are you going to do that? What are the timelines? So, you know, and include a job description because you're going to have that in there when you're submitting this.
Also attached to this is if you're recruiting new staff, you're applying for a grant, and you're going to be hiring perhaps a new position, include money in the application for advertising.
Yes.
That's an allowable cost, so make sure you're including that in there. If you use Indeed or one of those search engines or advertising your newspaper, make sure you include those costs. And for retention, I think a really important thing for staff retention is to include money for them to get ongoing training and education.
Yes.
So make sure you include that in your budget as well. Those are all allowable costs, and you should be asking for them along the way.
And I know, you know, the Department of Justice really encourages that too for VOCA, for SAVES grant, and for the VAWA grant. That, you know, they know it's important for you to either go to the coalitions, go to, you know, your local community trainings. It is important to enhance skill level.
Okay, so now we're getting to evaluation, and evaluation is really important. As we said, the funder identifies the broad problem, but it's up to you to identify the objectives and the outcomes, like how it is that if they fund you, you're going to help them resolve this problem. So this is one of the most important things. It's required by all funders, and it should also be helpful to you for knowing whether or not what you're doing, the services that you're providing, are really effective for all of and meeting the needs for all of the people who are coming to you. So you have to develop a useful, appropriate plan to evaluate your work and build it into your routine and draft a timeline for when you're going to do evaluation. So a lot of folks think of evaluation in fairly simplistic terms and aren't really measuring change. Sometimes folks apply for a legal advocate, and as evaluation you're going to say
serve so many people.
Serve X number of people or help X number of people get a restraining order. But we don't really know, so that's sort of like the hashtags on a piece of paper, right? But we don't really know how effective that is. I think while you may say in your grant application that your goal is to help 50 people receive restraining orders, and you should document that, that if you did that, so we helped 53 people get restraining orders. Well, that's great. You even exceeded that outcome. But how do you really know that getting that restraining order, how do we really know if that really made someone safer? So there has to be some component here where you're going to try to follow up and think about the questions that, for those of you who are in domestic violence programs with shelters, you have these questions that we ask you to ask of everybody. Do you have more access to resources, and do you feel safer as a result of these services? Even thinking about how you might incorporate those questions into your outreach is work. So helping someone get a restraining order, if we can get feedback from a victim saying that they feel safer as a result of getting that restraining order, that's a really important measure. for us to know.
Or 3 months down the line, too. I know on some of ours, we'll look at, are they, if we're doing a training, we look at 3 months, are they utilizing the skills? At 6 months, what are the follow-up? So I think back to the restraining order, so they may immediately feel safer, but if you're still working with them, how about at 3 months? How about at 6 months? That's a measurable outcome that 6 months after receiving our services in a restraining order, they're still feeling safe. Or half of them are, or whatever it is.
Right. And I get that some of you may not be able to do that. Some of you may not. Some of you may not be able to track people that long. Even if you can give 1 or 2 examples of folks who you've been able to track and say, we couldn't track everybody. Our services are crisis services. People are in and out, and we sometimes lose track of folks. But these are some folks who we did get some information from, and it was helpful to us.
Okay, so we have a question. So it says in the SAVES work plan, they have goals, activities, tasks to achieve goals, and then measurement criteria. So should the activities be thought of as objectives?
Yes, if they're broad. So think about that sample that we gave you. So if it's a big, broad objective, if you think about improve law enforcement responses to victims of domestic violence, and you're going to train, we're going to train law enforcement officers. Mm-hmm. So that's an objective. It's an activity as well, or a task that you're going to be achieving the goal. But then there's actually a number of activities that could be under that. I personally find it helpful to create a grid in these circumstances. And in the grid, at the top of the grid, I'll have the goal. The first column of the grid, I'll have the objectives. The second column, I'll have activities or action steps. Mm-hmm. The third column, I'll have who will implement that. Yes. And the fourth column, I'll have as a timeline. And I frequently do that because it really breaks it down and helps you see it visually. It helps them see your objective, what the action steps are you're going to take to implement that objective, who's going to do it, and by when are they going to do it.
Yes, so in the SAVES grant, so goals, you're right, it's broad. Activities would be what we're calling an objective, would be to train. And then your task are, you're breaking it down even further. I like Patti's visual. That's what I do too. I have, broad goal, and I think it's actually in the paperwork for SAVES, is that they have a grid that you're supposed to be using. So it's goals, and then you have objectives 1, 2, and then who's going to do them, but what are you going to do specifically for that? And that's where the tasks are, and then who's going to achieve it. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that answers your question.
You're welcome to call us afterwards, or I can actually send out copies of some of the activities we've done.
And there's another question. Is it always necessary to hire an evaluator to work throughout the project? Most people don't have evaluators on staff, and we're lucky that we do. But it's not feasible, I think, even to hire an outside consultant to look at. They're very expensive for an evaluator. So I think thinking creatively, and looking at what can we measure instead of just like pre and post tests. Like Patti was saying, it's very simple, but thinking about more of long-term, or how are we going to measure this? And you guys all know this. You've been doing the work, and you know what would I like to achieve, and then figuring out. Sometimes it's language, and Megan Murray is our evaluation person, and she will be happy to help with language in there. And I know we have different programs calling her and asking, because sometimes those questions that you're asking are going to get the answers that you need, and an evaluator has that. And another comment, it's best to verify with the funder what staff development is allowed. I think that's probably because, if I'm not mistaken, Patti, DOJ, the VOCA you can't use for out-of-state funding, correct?
Yeah, and you can use the VAWA for out-of-state funding, but you have to get approval in advance.
Yes, of the specific training that you want to go to.
Yeah, so you have to get advance approval. They may require you to file a grant adjustment notice again.
Yes.
For them to review and then sign off on before you can book anybody. So
even if we put it in our federal grant, we'll go to training or whatever it is, I still have to get pre-permission from my grant manager to whether it's the National Sexual Assault conference or whatever it is, and who's going specifically and what the costs are on the budget. So
right. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of communication with your funder on allowable trainings and whether or not you can send staff to various trainings.
Okay, we have another one. How do you get victim feedback without re-victimizing? I think it's just asking, like when Patti was talking about have the services, or do you feel safe after getting the restraining order? That, especially if you have an ongoing relationship with them at different marks at 3 or 6 months, then I don't think it's about re-traumatizing. You're not asking them about the trauma. You're just saying, are these services continuing to meet the needs that you have?
Mm-hmm.
And it's more about that than saying, oh, well, here, are you having flashbacks? Are you this? And especially if you're ongoing working with them, then you're going to have a better sense of what those are. Open-ended questions. So are these services still meeting your needs? Do you feel safe from the restraining order?
And always make everything optional. You
Yes.
know, there's no requirement that anyone answer anything. People should not feel forced to participate in our evaluation.
No.
But if folks are willing to tell you, yeah, I feel a bit safer because I have that restraining order, that's okay for you to be able to document that and say, of the 10 victims I worked with who I helped get restraining orders, only 3 replied who I had contact with. Only 3 were willing to offer feedback on how things were going with the restraining order, but all 3 of them said that they do feel safer. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. It just helps the funder to know. Folks know that particularly in this crime area where confidentiality is held at a premium, it's very difficult for us to get victim input to really know how things have changed. And quite honestly, we know it can change on a dime. If a victim feels safer for a month with a restraining order, and maybe the perpetrator is in jail and then gets let out of jail, and suddenly, even though the victim has a restraining order, the perpetrator is stalking and kind of hanging around, the person may not feel safe then. So we just know that the conditions surrounding this work can change frequently.
I think, too, it's important for anonymous answers on something, so it may be at 3 months, if you're still working with them, some broad questions, and just say, and have a drop box that they put it in so that nobody knows whose it is unless that they're willing to share that. Because I think if you're asking them questions in front of you, they're going to want to please you as the advocate or whoever's working. So I think in some ways asking those questions, would you mind, just filling this out really quick and dropping it, maybe 2 questions to ask them. And, that we want your feedback, but, if you will, and then just drop it on your way out.
So we're going to start talking a little bit about budget. We're realizing that we're in our last 15 minutes of this conversation with you all. So we've got to get to this really important topic, the budget. Budget is very critical, and whoever is reading or whoever is doing your budget, whether it be you or a staff accountant, you want to make sure that that person reads the announcement from cover to cover for buried requirements with funding. We know that sometimes funders will put things in the requirements like, if awarded, you must budget X amount of dollars to participate in a training, a particular training. So make sure you're reading that to make sure that say a funder might say, we require all staff who work in domestic violence shelters to go to a CPR course, and you want to budget in for that. Make sure that, I don't know that any of the funders do that, but it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Just make sure you're, okay. Oh, Peter just reminded us that the webinar is scheduled till 11:30, so we do have extra time. Please just make sure that your budget, the person who's drafting the budget, whether it be you or an accounting staff person, reads that and looks for all of those requirements. Budget very strategically. Make sure you're including sufficient funds for overhead, and that includes things like rent, office supplies, a portion of the copier, a portion of your audit. All of those things are overhead.
Liability
insurance and supervisory time. They're really important to include so that you, in every grant budget, so that you are able to cover those costs and not paying those other costs out of unrestricted funds. Those kinds of overhead costs should be split amongst every single grant that you have. Make sure you answer all of the budget questions completely and be very transparent about what it is that you're doing in that budget. And then make sure you write out a basis for your calculations. So don't just say to yourself, well, I think we're going to allocate $3,000 in office supplies for this position. You're really going to have to do a basis, because I can tell you already, every funder will come back to you and say, how did you come up with that number? Please give us your calculations. You want to get fewer questions in your budget rather than more, because getting lots of questions about how you did things will make funders somewhat suspicious about what your intentions are with the funds. So just write out your basis for all your calculations. I gave you an example. Travel for 4 people times 100 miles times 46 cents a mile equals $184. Make sure that if the funder has particular per diem rates for mileage or for meals or for hotel, that you're researching and allocating funds at the rate. The coalitions are both federally funded and state funded. I'm not sure how WCASA does it, but with federal funds, we allocate at federal per diem for federal travel. And when staff are federally funded but doing in-state travel, we do everything at the state rate.
And we just have one rate that we just use the state rate for everybody and bill it at the state rate, not at the federal rate.
So, and then the last thing is really just make sure your numbers add up. Go through each section, and then you have to attach a summary document to your budget that breaks down the personnel, breaks down overhead, contractual. There are all these, the summary sheet makes you do this. Make sure that whatever you enter on that summary sheet adds up exactly the same as what you've included on the budget. I can say that we frequently, when reviewing grants, I frequently see those things not adding up, what people do individually, not adding up and matching what's on the summary document. We frequently see people miss things like putting in FICA, or all of the costs of employment. Whether you're providing benefits or not, we have to pay all those federal and state taxes. So you really need to make sure that that's included in your budget. It's more, every staff person has a salary, but then the cost of that person is generally way more than what their salary is. And a lot of those way more costs are required under the law. So you have to make sure you're including those. Because the funders will double check them and will say, we notice that you aren't including any of the federally required taxes for unemployment tax and all those kinds of things. So make sure that those are included. Match is another thing that that isn't in this section, but we should talk about really quickly. If the grant requires match, and not all grants will require match. If you're applying, for example, for the VAWA, the Stop VAWA through Wisconsin DOJ, the Federal Violence Against Women Act exempts victim service providers from providing match, but many of our funders do require match. VOCA requires it, SAVES requires it, DCF requires it. If the grant requires match, make sure you use an appropriate source. State funds can be used to match a federal grant. So when you apply for VOCA or VAWA, those are two, even though they're coming through the state, they're federal funds. So you should be using state or county or foundation dollars as your match.
So like United Way, SAVES is local money. The state money you can use. Foundation money, DCF money, correct? Right, through the state.
Through the state. Federal funds, you can use state funds to match, but you can't use state funds to match state funds, and you can't use federal funds to match federal funds. So you have to make sure you're matching with appropriate source. You should read whether or not a portion or all of the match can be in kind.
SAVES does not require a match.
Right. You should then, if you're offering in-kind match, you should think about what that looks like. If you're thinking about using donations as a match, you have to have a process. You have to document donations, like in-kind donations, like people give you shampoo or clothes or things like that. You have to have a way of documenting a value for that, for those things. You don't give that value back to the donor, but you document it for your own records. There was a recent discussion on the DV Directors Listserv about this. You should never be assigning a value when someone's donating a bag of clothes to you. They assign the value, but you have to have a way to document a value and attach a value to that if you're using that for match. And generally, people think using the goodwill identification, value identification process is the best way to do that.
And for sexual assault programs, a lot of us have volunteers, volunteer advocates that will go in or answer the crisis line or whatever.
Same for DV.
Yes. So you put a dollar value on that. What would an average dollar value be? And however many hours you're documenting their hours, and that can be used for match.
Right.
So you just need to keep track of it.
Right. You have to have a way to track volunteer hours if you're using volunteer hours. Or if you're organizing meetings and asking people to come to meetings, you need to have a sign-in sheet and document the number of, if you're hosting meetings that are related to this project. Say you're applying for funds for coordinated community response and you're using the attendees at the CCR meeting as their participation in the meeting as match. You need to document their participation. And it's not you writing down who they are. They all have to sign a meeting sign-up sheet. And you have to keep that in your records and in your files. So match is tricky, but there's lots of ways to do it, and you really need to make sure that it's there.
And another thing, too, on the budget, when you're looking at, like, staff, so so-and-so was hired at $30,000 a year, and then what is the percentage of time that they're going to put into this particular project? And you need to make sure that that is not only in the budget, but it's going to match what is you put in the narrative. So if this person is, spending 90% of their time will be on da-da-da-da-da, and they're only funded 50% in the budget, you need to make sure that they're matching.
Right.
And to be very clear about that. So if it's a $30,000 salary and it's, 50% of their time, then you're charging 50%, which would be $15,000, and the benefits would be half of a full time. So I mean, you need to spell that out in your budget, and the clearer you can be about that and how you came up with the formula, and like even for fringe benefits. So if there's a different cost to each employee, then that's what you need to put. So employee A, their health insurance is, $5,000. Their FICA is this, and you're spelling that out, getting a total, and then this grant is going to pay 50% of that.
Right.
I think the more information you can give and the clearer your formulas are, the better you're going to be.
What I can say is most funders will not take a general number, so sometimes people want to write benefits are 30% of the salary.
Yeah, and
that's not an appropriate calculation. They want to see the actual breakdown of what all of the costs are, what the taxes are, what any insurances are that you are covering for people. They want to see the actual cost per person. Now, the insurances can be hard right now with the ACA, because if we are hiring somebody new into a position, we understand that the ACA, and you're covering insurance, and maybe you have an ACA compliant plan, the amount of someone's insurance varies based upon the age of the person, and you may not know the age. In that case, I might budget it at the highest level if you're providing insurance, and say we don't know the age, but we have to budget for worst case scenario.
Okay, we have another question. Can you talk about grants that have specific set-aside amounts for certain populations? That's up to the funders. There are, I know when you're looking at federal grants, they'll talk about population-specific, like for Native or tribal programs. I don't think any of our local ones are having anything about specific.
No, the VAWA fund has the state-administered Stop Violence Against Women Act fund has set aside funds for culturally specific populations.
And what is that amount? I don't remember.
I think it's 25% of the victim services pot.
Oh, yeah.
So 25% of that pot has to be for culturally specific services. You really have to read the grant application to know if you're a mainstream program and you want to provide culturally specific services. Some of the grants will allow you to apply, and some of the grants are very directive and say that that only a culturally specific service provider can apply to provide the culturally specific services. So again, it's absolutely critical that you read and understand whether or not you are an eligible applicant for that particular funding source if you're interested in culturally specific services.
And I would always ask the funders, ask for a clarifying, or send them an email and ask clarifying, this is what I am intending to do, and they can tell you the scope of it. They can't tell you, yes, you can apply, or no, you can't apply, but they can tell you, no, this needs to be a cultural specific program that's applying.
Right.
So read everything.
Even though it may be really appealing, there are very clear reasons why some funders want that money to go directly to culturally specific service providers. So you just have to look, if you're wanting to provide culturally specific services, look for funding. If you're a mainstream organization, look for funding sources that support that kind of work coming out of a mainstream organization. I also wanted to say one more thing about budget before we got off it, and I totally forgot it already. Oh, I hate when that happens. Those of you who are menopausal on this call will understand the humor of that, forgetting things. Oh, I wanted to say, whoever writes the budget, if you have an external accountant, our accountant, we have an accountant who she reads every application, not just the RFP, but before we submit the application, once we've written it, she reads the whole thing. I cannot tell you how many times she catches things that should appear in the budget that we've said we're going to do.
Yeah.
She'll read through it and she'll say, I noted that you say you're going to do meetings here at this location. Are you going to be compensating people's mileage? Are you going to be reimbursing folks for hotel? I need to put that in the budget. So whoever does the budget, if it is not the writer, the author of the grant, make sure they read through the narrative that's been written too, because they may catch things. You just don't want to find yourself in a situation where you've done a proposal and then you haven't allocated enough funds to fully support it, because those funds to support it are going to have to come from someplace, probably unrestricted if you have no other funding source to cover it.
Right.
And then you're giving up precious unrestricted funds to cover a grant when the money could have been included. So I can't say enough how absolutely important that is. So we're at the end, and we've talked about editing, share it with somebody else, have that person edit it for clarity. Don't be ashamed to have somebody read your ideas or your writing. I can't stress enough, this isn't actually a penmanship competition or a writing competition. Lots of folks aren't super skilled, like technical writers. I myself am not one. I am much more of a stream of consciousness writer, and then I get all my ideas out and I hand the grant over to somebody else to do technical writing and make the words and sentences make more sense than what I did. So I can't say enough about how important that is. Because you may have great ideas but not be the best writer, and that's okay. So before you submit, just again, have somebody else review the final document for any errors or confusing formatting or confusing sentences. Sometimes you think you've expressed something really well and you haven't. Follow the submission process instructions exactly, including the exact time in which that is supposed to be turned in. If you turn your grant in 1 minute late, it will be rejected. And I can tell you, probably some people on this call have experienced it. Decide to drive to Madison with your grant to get it in. And if it's date stamped, even 1 minute late, it will be rejected. It won't even be reviewed. So that is super important. And that leads to the last bullet here is just submit early. If you can set a false date, I always set a date that's about 3 days before it's due and get in my mind that it's due on this date, not on this date. And I just keep saying, oh, that grant's due on the 27th, not due on the 30th. And I don't say not due on the 30th. I just keep saying it's due on the 27th.
And I do the same.
Because that way, that's my target date, and I get it in early. And if anything goes wrong, I'm prepared to deal with whatever goes wrong, because I have that little buffer time. Lots of folks wait until that last possible moment, and most funders are completely and totally non-negotiable on the timing. So that's really important. So we're going to open it up for more questions if you have them.
Thank you.
No questions? We've answered every question.
Wow.
Examples available. What kinds of examples do folks want? Do people want, I'm happy to share, coalition grants are very different than direct service grants.
Yes.
I'm happy to share a sample of a coalition grant. You would have
I would too.
really translate that into something different. I'd be happy to share. We do some direct services at our coalition, obviously. We have a law center. I would be happy to share that because that is a direct service. Budgets and narratives. So we want both examples of budgets and narratives. I would share budgets if I can delete the specific staff salary information, but happy to give you the rest of the budget. So I can get copies of that to Peter, and I don't know if we have a Dropbox where we can post, so we can just send it out to everybody who registered for this.
Yeah, and I can do the same too. Just get the identifying information off of there, but you can see, the rest of what we do. Narratives, they're going to be a little different on our grants, but you can see how we're answering the specific questions because that has to be done the exact same way that you guys do. Right. It's just we're not doing the direct work.
Yes, we can. I can actually get some examples of a well-written narrative and not so well-written narrative. Actually, Sharon Lewandowski often does grant training and has some narratives that she's sort of switched around a little bit and has redacted all identifying information. So I'll ask her if I can get those samples and share with you. And somebody wants to know, can we talk about how to utilize staff in writing the application based on the work they do? What is this process? When we have a grant that's specific to a particular staff person's role, we sit down and meet with that person. I ask that person, actually this is a leadership opportunity, a leadership growth opportunity. I ask that person if they want to write sections of the grant. And it will always be draft. And I talk to them about the importance of the timeline, giving enough time, whether or not they really feel like they can do that. I will tell you our staff are very honest about saying, yes, I can do it, no, I can't do it. At a minimum, we do conversations with the staff who are funded with various grants about how their work is changing, how they want to evolve it, what do they want us to include in the next year. And so that's how you can do it. And it really empowers staff. It connects them. Then once the grant narrative is done, again, you don't have to give the person the personnel budget, but once the grant narrative is done and the project-related budget is done, I always give copies of that back to the staff person.
And one of the things that we do as part of the mentoring into leadership roles is our grants that are on like e-grants and the different systems. So I'll sit down with the staff, write the drafts or whatever, but we don't, the budgets are on there too, and so whoever, like the CCR SART, if that is on e-grants, then they help write it, but they're also helping with the quarterly reporting in e-grants so that they understand what the goals and objectives are right from the beginning. And so and some staff are not as comfortable, and so it is a slow learning. So what part can you do, or I sit down with them as they're evolving their skill level, and they're more comfortable, they'll do it or they'll send it to me, and then I'll check it, and then we'll submit it. So that they're understanding the grant process from very beginning to what are we reporting, because I think that's important too, is how, what do you have to give to the funders to report? And, how are you accountable to this? And I think it helps them see that, especially goals that need to be obtainable, that, okay, this quarter, this is what I was supposed to get done. Well, I didn't get this done. Well, then you have to write a reason why you didn't. So I think that helps with, the evolution of it helping pull people up through and into leadership roles.
So we have a question about the implementation plan and work plans. How many goals would be optimal? Do they want 5 or 20? I would say between 1 and 3.
And some of them specify. Some of the grants I know specify, they'll say like 3 separate goals, or the goal, I mean, it would be great to have 3 goals or whatever it is. And I agree with Patti, between 1 and 3.
Yeah, we frequently submit, grants for a couple $100,000 with just one goal.
Yep, and then the objectives are different on them, but yes, I agree. And then shorter is better.
Yes.
So
somebody wants to know, say more on start to finish process. Oh boy.
I'm not sure what they want. So
maybe you could ask the question a little bit more specifically.
Yes.
Connected to the last question. So the goals and objectives start to finish. The process of working with. Okay. So process of working with staff. So when an RFP is released, a request for a proposal is released, and let's. There are, as you guys know, there are continuing grants, and then there are new grant applications, something which you may seek new funding for. If it's a continuing grant, for me it's an automatic that it just goes immediately to the staff person who's been working in that grant for the last year or more. So that those staff who are identified in a continuing grant proposal simply are going to be in a position of updating what they're doing, and giving us information about where they've been, where they want to go. If it's a brand new grant application for which we may either be shifting duties of some staff to take on or hiring altogether new staff, I'm going to seek the most relevant staff to that issue area. And sit down with them and say, yeah, I'm going to give them the RFP in advance, set up a meeting, and just talk with them about what are your ideas for this. Should we apply for this grant? Do we have the capacity to apply for this grant? Is this something that we think we should be doing? And then how do you think we should be implementing it? And just seek that input. It's very easy. And then usually if I'm the writer, the author of the grant, I'm going to give it back to those staff people for review. I may ask some of them to write sections of the grant, and I will edit it, or I may write sections and they will edit it. It's really a back and forth process. There's really not there's no lose to involving staff in the writing of the grants that they serve.
Well, and the creativity too again, it's also about mentoring people up through the ranks or whatever you want to call it, but and helping them, because I'm going to tell you, I have a master's degree in clinical psychology, and grant writing was not one of the classes I ever took, and so I started writing small grants, and then got associate director, and then was responsible for more grants, and then as an ED you kind of get thrown in that. There's no classes that I know of. It's like 101 how to write a grant. You're just kind of looking at somebody else's, and that's what I did. I looked at somebody else's that had done it before and then tried to hone my skills into what felt more comfortable for me. But yeah, it is, most of us as directors are just kind of thrown into this. People don't have English or writing backgrounds that are doing this work. We started as advocates.
So the next question has to do with budgeting and a concern about asking for too much, or should we shoot for the moon and stars, requesting a lot. I think you should request the amount that is needed. You shouldn't over-request or under-request. Most funders say in the RFP, say they have $500,000 available, and they will say we are looking to fund five applicants at $100,000 apiece. You're not going to go over $100,000. You can come in under, but don't stretch your budget and put in things that are not logical to the grant application. So most of the funders have an upper limit and say we're going to
max budget.
Max budget should be X. If they don't, that's a good question to ask of the funder. What's the typical amount you're looking to fund? What's the maximum amount you're looking to fund? There have been times when funders have released RFPs and haven't identified that maximum budget, but have said, we have $500,000 to fund victim services, for example, and we have one applicant will apply for all $500,000. They may fund that applicant, but because they're usually looking to fund more than one person or more than one agency, they're unlikely to fund just one entity for the whole enchilada, if you will. They're gonna want to spread it out. So if they haven't identified the top end, it's a really good question to go back to the funder. All funding entities have a period of time in which you can ask questions, as you know, and you should be making use of that time to get clarity on what you should do. But when the question is, should we make it a practice to shoot for the moon and stars, I would say request what you need, not a lot of stuff that may not be needed. Request what you need within the amount of what they're offering. And with that, I also want to say, if they're offering $100,000 and you want to hire one full-time staff, but that doesn't cover all of the overhead and other program-related costs associated with that, you need to scale back your project to fit into the $100,000. So maybe you're going to end up hiring a 3/4 FTE. Do not hurt yourself by not including adequate overhead. Always include adequate overhead.
We've got another question. So when there are multiple counties being served, do they want goals designed for the specific counties? And this person put, we've always done similar goals but different tasks for each county. It makes for a long document. I would say each county, you can say, we're working to end sexual violence, and then the task, each county is going to be different, and probably how you're doing it because your relationships are different.
But the goal can be the same.
But the goal can be the same, yes. So I would say your implementation plan may be a little different. I like how you said we do different tasks in each one of the communities, and I think that is the way that you need to do that because each one of them is different.
Right. But yeah, remember goals are very broad, often intangible. So, your goal, broad goal would be, to increase victim safety, domestic and sexual violence victim safety. That's a big intangible goal. And then you're going to have objectives underneath for what you're that are more tangible, that what you're doing to work towards that big intangible goal.
Right.
And that could apply across multiple communities.
Okay, we have another question. Okay, can you submit cost for a position that also assists positions that the grant doesn't cover? An example, SAVE's funding is sexual assault specific, but an office assistant who answers the crisis line will assist DV advocates. It's only for the, you can't split people, but if they're doing DV stuff and it's sexual assault funding only, then you can't cover all of their salary. But what you can say is that, the time is split, so let's be reasonable, 50% this and 50% on the SA or the DV. You can't fund it all under SA money if it's not doing just sexual assault.
Right. So if the office assistant is helping the sexual assault person as well, a percentage of that person's time could be included in the SAVES grant. If the office assistant is not helping the sexual assault person at all, which would be hard to imagine because an office assistant.
Well, if they're answering phones or anything, they are helping.
Yeah. So And you calculate that percentage by taking the salary of the person who is funded under that grant. So say you have one person, one saved person funded fully under that grant. Take your entire personnel budget for all of your staff and divide the saved person salary by the entire budget, and you'll get the percentage of which you should charge to the office assistant. That will be something like 2% or 3%. But that lets you know what piece of the pie that office assistant is giving, should be giving
to that grant.
To that grant.
Yes. And we use the same formula.
I hope that's clear. If it isn't, let me know.
Okay, we have another question. Okay, requirement attachment. Should we submit letters of support and MOUs related to this project if we have them? So VAWA doesn't have them listed in the required attachments.
But if you're proposing a collaborative, there's no downside to submitting them.
Correct.
Even if it's not required, it demonstrates that it's a collaboration.
Right.
So I would say yes.
I would too.
Unless they say that they don't want them. Some grants say letters of support not necessary or MOUs not necessary. I've seen those.
Right.
So but if they don't identify it one way or another, you're totally fine to include it, and it actually demonstrates that it is a real collaboration.
Right. You're not just writing it in there. Oh, well, we're going to do this, but that that they're signing on and that you're including things that are going to be done in the grant. And again, like Patti said before, if you're collaborating with somebody, especially a non-for-profit, then build some money into that budget for them. And I think that's a respectful thing to do. It is the correct thing to do because we all don't want to, do stuff for free and we're helping out each other. But and I think that's going to lend more credibility to that too. Well, we're coming up on the end. Does anybody else have any questions for us? We will get the required or the asked for documents. Patty's going to get the narrative that was well done and one that maybe isn't so well done. We can both get the budget information out to you. Peter can send it out. We can do, send this PowerPoint and any documents that we feel could be helpful. So, okay, if I don't see any more questions, thank you for whoever joined us. I hope this was helpful. You know what, and you can always send feedback to us about, maybe more in-depth or what we need to do. We're working with DOJ on trying to get a more detailed, not the coalitions, but they were talking about a technical college doing more intense training on grant writing. And Patti said Sharon does that too, because I think it's important to have documents, have examples given to you about this is what we're looking for and this is what we aren't specifically, and I think that was helpful for me as a director and probably for other people.
So thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you in a couple weeks, many of you.
At the director's meeting. At
the director's meeting. For those of you who are directors on this call, I notice a number of you are not directors, but
yes.
Good luck to you all in your grant writing, and please feel free to call us. The two coalitions can't write letters of support. At least I don't write letters of support in big competitive grant applications. But if you're applying for something federally, I always happily write a letter of support if it's not like a huge competitive thing that every program in Wisconsin is applying for. So we are here to support you and make sure that you get the funding that you need and deserve to serve the victims that you're dealing with in your communities. Thanks a lot for being here.
And thanks for all the work that you do. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.